I want to lean heavy tonight into the call toward maturity, because I think this is a really, really significant piece for us as leaders, but also for how we think about ministry and how
Mm-hmm.
we think about pastoring
Yeah.
and how we're looking at our people in the communities and our own concept of their development.
Yeah.
So a lot of um, a lot of my thought and organization around families has there's been a nice intersection as being a marriage and family therapist and working with families from a developmental standpoint. But I came in the last few years, I've had a lot of conversations with pastors and people in the church where there's a probably a lot of you are experiencing it. There culturally is a real great tension around power and hierarchy right now, society wide, and in a lot of our church contexts. That as there's been a lot of people in positions of power who have hurt people and failed and fallen down, it raises questions about power structures and systems. And one of the things that we've watched happen over about the last 10 years is a response to the hierarchy and the way power is used in the hierarchy, in this push away towards a flattening, towards a plural leadership,
Yeah.
is language that a lot of people are using, toward a round table or a flattened pyramid. These are all just different catchphrases and language that people will use in trying to swing away from hierarchical power structures. And I think there's a lot of great validity in that, because I don't think any of us have to look too far to identify places of abuse of power in places where the hierarchical structures are actually undermining the growth and health of a community as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
One of the concern that really has raised up within me as I've been watching this is that we're swinging, which is what we do culturally and what we do in our family systems, where you have one
Mm-hmm.
experience and we just swing all the way to the other
Mm-hmm.
end, and then the next generation is going to swing all the way back, and we just watch generationally the pendulum going back and forth. And I think in the pendulum swings, we always have a way of missing the kingdom,
Yeah.
that we catch into cultural concepts, we catch into reactive pain rooted concepts, and we often miss the orientation of the kingdom. And so I'm going to walk through um, a few of the concerns that I'm noticing, that these are things that are being voiced by people that I'm working with. I have a lot of people that I work with in my office who have been pretty jacked up by church. And so I spent a lot of time processing what their experience is with pastors have been. So there's just a lot of mining of information from that. Um, Own observations and experiences, talking with other pastors and some of the conflicts. So I'm going to walk through some of the concern that is being revealed and shown. I actually want to tap into a little bit. I think that there are some real significant um, things that are present in our culture that, if we're attentive to, we can really lean into well to help bring the kingdom into places that is longing for it, places that people are actually really eager. Probably a lot of you have looked at the research that while nationally the association to religion is decreasing tremendously, the
Mm-hmm.
connection to spirituality is ever increasing, and that there's a real difference in the trajectory of those. And there's some things that are present in our culture that are ripe for a particular way of engaging.
Yeah.
And that's what I want to just talk about those a little bit. And then I want to shift into talking about the type of leadership that I think we really need moving forward into the next season, to what in whatever way it looks for you. That I just like there's no two parents that are exactly the same. I think trying to create like a mold for a leader is really unhelpful,
Yeah.
because what my daughter needs from a father is going to be different than what some of your kids need from a father, or from a mother. And so being having there be room for flexibility and creativity is really important. But I think there are some general constructs and themes that we can orient ourselves around. So
Yeah.
yeah, okay. So
Okay.
a few of the concerns that I have been seeing or hearing voiced. One, like I mentioned, the dysfunction of the hierarchical power, a hierarchical power structure for leadership. And this isn't just in the church. We're seeing this in so many different segments of society, and the dysfunction that comes when power is concentrated in one spot and held in that way. That one of the things that is, you can look through history at this, that when people gain power, the priority becomes maintaining power. And as soon as a priority is maintaining power, we're no longer seeking the benefit of those around us, we're seeking the benefit of ourselves. And this is where that idea of power corrupting comes in, because there's some real, those of us who have been in positions of leadership and positions of power, there's some really wonderful things and experiences that come out of being the person at the top of the pyramid, and losing that and entering into some chaos and some pain, is not everyone has the same graciousness upon letting go of power. And we're seeing this in the church. I hear this all the time in my office about people who've been abused by people who have held on to power and used it for their own benefit. Paired with that, there's a real growing distrust of organizations as a whole. I don't know how this is showing up in your communities, but this is something I'm hearing from a lot of people in and out of my office, and just skepticism and distrust of what leadership is speaking. So when you hear someone from an organization say, this is what we're about, the number of eyebrows that go up that go, sure, we'll find out. And just a general distrust of congruence within organizations, particularly within religious organizations, not exclusively Christian, but it's predominant right now in our culture, this distrust of organizational structures. Yeah, I imagine a lot of you, I know this because we've talked about this, the presence of both the experience of church hurt, but also the presence of the conversation and language of church hurt. Like, this is a real present conversation that's happening in our society, and that just about anything society takes, there's often a accentuation of it that is rooted in reactivity to pain, right? So when people start talking about church hurt, a whole bunch of people will jump on the bandwagon, and now there's a whole lot of people that are railing against things. And so those involved in church can sit and go like, wait, hold on. That was your dad. That wasn't the church. And we can start to pull this apart. But I think it would be problematic for us to push back too strongly against the concept of church hurt, because just like we've been talking about with our pain cycle, pain is always real. It doesn't always have the right language that's put on it. It isn't always expressed the right way, but the pain that's underneath whatever is being expressed is always real. And there's some wisdom in being attentive to where that language and conversations around church hurt is emerging. Because if we can welcome it and lean into it and have some conversations, it actually will give us access to a lot of the pain that people are having. One of the things that I'm recognizing, and I think there's a lot of other people that are starting to tap on this when it comes to leadership, is the awareness that power and control don't bring about the heart change that we're actually after with discipleship. That we can't teach people into discipleship. We can't give rules that transform the heart of people. And this is as old as our theology, right? This is the 10 Commandments and the Jesus coming and bringing a new way of doing things that for our entire history, right? Even as a people, as the people of God, there's been this tension between rules, organization, power, relationship, freedom, and grace, and what actually brings about the transition of the heart. And we're in an era of time in the church where more and more we're seeing people recognize rules, control, power that's not transforming lives. And so we need to do some other things. And not only are leaders becoming aware of it, the people who have been trying to be controlled are aware of it. They're going, I followed all your rules. I actually got more hurt because I followed all your rules. We hear, particularly, you hear this a lot in a lot of the language that's coming out of the pushback against purity culture, in the way that a lot of people that followed rules and did the right thing came out. And I'll tell you, I got all sorts of Christian couples in my office whose sex life is miserable, because they went through an era of 10 or 15 years where they just turned the whole thing off because they followed rules. And then they got into marriage and thought it would be a switch, and it's just a disaster. And so culturally, there's just an awareness that rules don't transform hearts and lives, but we don't always know what to do instead or how to navigate that. And in response, this is where that pendulum comes in of going, okay, if rules and power don't work, let's throw all of those out. Let's just all be friends together. Let's journey through this together. And what we're finding is that when you get a bunch of people who don't know where they're going together, people don't know where they're going and they don't know how to get there, and they spin around. And we got pockets of people from a bunch of different of our generations culturally who are spinning trying to find their way forward, rejecting a lot of the power structures and hierarchy, trying to do this in a pure way, and not experiencing the life change that they're longing for. And so even as we're attentive to the concern around structure and systems and power and control, swinging it the other way and just going, let's be friends, let's hold each other's hands, let's all walk through this. Yes, we need empathy and care and connection, but the void to just void leadership as a whole, in many ways leaves all of us lost and leaves our people lost. And so one of the concerns that I have as I'm watching pastors come into ministry who lean really relational heavy, there's a real hesitancy to give direction, to create structures and guidance, because there's almost this recoil against the way that they perceive that. And so like, I don't want to touch that. I don't want to go into that. And we run the risk of swinging all the way to the other side.
Yeah. Well, I mean, are you going to share about our experience?
Yeah, I will in a minute.
Cool.
In one of the other significant concerns that I have about our culture as I'm watching it is we're in an era of time that has a significant emphasis on personal choice, in the freedom of personal choice. But what is absent, by and large, as a whole, is communal responsibility. That there's this concept that I get to make the choices that I want to make because I have the freedom to do that. That's true. Absolutely. What so many people don't hold on to, don't think about, don't carry is that every choice we make has a communal impact, and there's a responsibility that we have in that context of community.
Okay, say it in a different way.
I'm going to say it in a different way.
Cool.
Okay. If we take that into a family system construct, right? Children make the choices that they want to make, and they're trying to figure out what choices they want to make. And they're only thinking about themselves. And when their choice goes not the way that they want it to go, or someone tells them they can't make their choice, they freak out. My daughter is laying on her back on the ground, screaming multiple times every day because she wants personal choice.
But she can't talk yet.
She can't talk. She just freaks out about it. And when we look at society, we have a lot of people who are engaging in that developmental stage of trying to, in some ways, this is a reaction to an overly oppressive, controlled concept and construct in systems that have said you don't get to have choices, you need to follow the rules. So now you have a whole bunch of people pushing back and go, no, you can't tell me what to do. I get to make choices, which from a developmental standpoint is actually a really appropriate part of development. The concern is we're going to get stuck here if we don't have people that teach children how to have communal responsibility. If we don't teach children how to hold the freedom of personal choice with the responsibility to our family. And that as parents, this is something we have to teach our children, right? None of our children intuitively learn how to share and why taking turns matters and why giving things to other people, like some cue in to go like, oh, I get bonus points when I share my toy, which is also very self-serving.
Right.
But to truly develop the understanding of the benefits of becoming a family, someone has to teach the children. And one of my concerns is that we are actually becoming a collective society of children, and no one is stepping in to teach us. Or you end up with other kids who get mad and go like, no, throw away your personal choice. And we go right back to rules, which is why we're in the space that we are. We can't just push back against that, but we need some people who can step into a parental spot of maturity, who can teach people how to hold the freedom of personal choice alongside communal responsibility. And what I'm seeing in society with the people in my room is most of the people that I sit with can't identify any sort of relational or spiritual parental figure in their life. That by and large, they have some biological parents, some are better than others. But by and large, if I say, who's parenting your soul? Who's parenting your emotions? Who's helping you as a grown-up figure out how to be a grown-up? The number of people who have an answer to that question is alarming, because it's almost nobody. And what that tells me is we have a culture that expects people to grow up, but no one wants to parent them into adulthood. And so we're going to run the risk of being a society that stays children. And if we do, we're going to swing right back to power and control, because the best way to keep kids well behaved is control.
Yep.
It's not the best way to help kids grow up, but it is the best way to control behavior. And we're at a spot where if we go too far without really taking seriously the need to grow into maturity ourselves, but also help other people grow into maturity, we're going to swing back into rigidity, and no one's actually going to grow and develop.
Well, just like think about I think more about teenagers, right? So if we are parenting adults, like if we view ourselves as spiritual parents to other adults, it's more of like they're teenagers. They need the rope to be let out a certain degree so they can go figure it out. But if you pull it in real tight because they make a mistake or they hurt someone in your church, like in your church or in your family, then that's going to have ramifications. And so giving personal choice, but also being community minded is very difficult with people that are our same age.
So the good news is I actually think that there are a great number of things present in our society that are really, really ripe to be harvested, to be leaned into, to be engaged for people who can lean into this a little bit. So I hear so much, and even I've been a therapist for 5-6 years now, pastor for longer, even in the last 10 years, I'm hearing more honest conversation in the last 2 years than any of the time before that about the verbalized longing for connection and the verbalized uncertainty of how to find it and how to build it. That I'm hearing explicit people saying, I need connection, I need relationship. I don't know how to do it. I don't know where to find it. I don't know how to figure it out. And this is, I hear this all over the place. And coming out of COVID, where we've had a year of disconnection, this is a season where that is front and center more than I remember it ever being in our society at any other point, which means that if we are relationally and connection attentive, this is an incredible time to bring Jesus into some spaces in some ways that haven't been welcoming to Jesus, into the community of Jesus in ways before. So I think that's a real asset that we have going for us. I also think that as a society, we have a heightened level of reactivity. I think when we look at last year on a social level, there's more explicit anger. There's more expressed frustration and pushback. There's more discontent. There is more pain being vocalized. There's more reactivity. And while a lot of people are getting really worried about heightened reactivity and where's this going to go, what we know, because we just walked through all that stuff around the pain cycle, is that when reactivity is present, that's actually our access point to the pain that's underneath it. And when people keep their reactivity hidden, it's a lot harder to tap into their pain, find it. But we're in a society where reactivity and pain is all over the place. And if we know how to talk about it and we know how to lean into it, there are so many hurting people who are looking for someone to hear their pain, to understand their pain, to enter into their pain, which is fundamentally incarnational when we think about our gospel.
Well, I just think of like the hot, the cold, the lukewarm. Like this past year, there's no lukewarm. Everyone's hot or they're cold. And that reactivity is happening. But that's what allows us to actually shift. That allows us to change. That allows us to see things in a different way. If we're lukewarm, we're sitting in the middle in that regard. We're not going to actually have access. Like if you weren't reactive, I could be like, hey, and you sit there and like, well, okay, bye. Like you don't have interaction. So reactivity is an opportunity to actually dialogue, to move, to shift, to change. So
any therapist will tell you that ambivalence is the worst thing to find in the therapy room. That particularly when you're working with couples, if you have a couple that's ambivalent about their relationship, they're just kind of like, man, take it, leave it, whatever. We're not going anywhere. If you got a couple that's fighting against each other, or you got a couple that's fighting for each other, we can work with that, because that means that our pain is close to the surface and we have things to work with. And as a society, we have come out of a season of ambivalence and into a season of reactivity, which is actually a really wonderful opportunity for those leaders who are not scared to get messy in the pain.
Yeah, and this is where like kingdom of God stuff happens because
Mhm.
it's accessible.
Yep.
And
Yep.
when we don't have access, it's more of like we have
Mhm.
to stir the pot and get it warmer, get it warmer, get it warmer. We're saying like it's hot now.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
it's good that we're learning this stuff so that we can be people who help guide people into
Mhm.
correct behavior or
Mhm.
correct thinking, or I hate that word though. I don't want
Yeah.
to use that.
Correct is
Correct is not the right word.
useful,
Useful,
helpful.
transformative. Okay, here we go.
Yep.
Like,
Okay. Yep. And you probably are running into, I'm imagining you're running into this in a lot of your conversations, because I'm finding this in a lot of conversations with other pastors and other leaders, where a lot of pastors are wanting to do something different, not certain how to do it. There's culturally, society wide, a growing awareness of the impact of mental health and emotional and relational connection. A lot of pastors do this really poorly. I will periodically listen to pastors that I hear are going to give sermons on mental health and emotional connection, and probably 8 times out of 10, I'm cringing, because we're grabbing language that we don't understand and trying to utilize it and fit it into old constructs to move people forward
yeah, it's
without actually stopping and sitting and understanding people.
Mhm.
Because I'll tell you, society is talking about mental health. Our society is talking about relational and emotional pain. And so, if we as people can actually lean into these things, the door is wide open for Jesus to come right into those places
Mhm.
with us. Um,
Preach.
and because of that, there's a longing for people to find a context of love and trustworthiness. That people are looking for safe relationships. They're looking for relationships that can speak identity to them. They're looking for relationships that they can exhale with and build trust and can talk openly and talk honestly. So those two pillars that we've been talking about this whole time, about love that forms identity and trustworthiness that grounds us in a sense of safety, our world is screaming and looking for them everywhere. And there are very few communities who actually know how to hold those honestly, to wrestle with them, to talk about them. And this isn't just the church, this is clubs, communities, contexts, organizations across the board
Yeah.
that are trying to figure this out. And most of us are doing it really, really poorly. And man, if the church could be the place that could really grab a hold of the opportunity that's available to be a place that speaks identity through experiences of love
Mhm.
and creates context of safety, not by declaring it,
Yeah.
but by openly wrestling with it and honestly wrestling with the places that it's not. We have an opportunity to be a church that actually is this oasis in the midst of a desert, right? This hospital for the broken, these metaphors that we talk about and we try to claim. And yet,
Mhm.
when we look at our communities, um, there aren't a lot of people who come to the church as a hospital. A lot of them go to therapists and go to other places, and we want to keep those places. But man, I would love for the church to really increase its presence in those places. And I think there's a lot of access to that right now and availability for that. The one other really positive thing that I'm seeing in society is actually the generational growth. And when it comes to love and safety, and I want to walk us through for a minute, because I think every generation has a tendency to look back and malign the generation that came before because they jacked it all up and missed so many things. And that's always true. That we always learn things that the previous generation didn't know and didn't see and therefore couldn't do. So it's really easy to just kind of talk bad about Gen X and baby boomers in the previous generations, and we can really kind of throw people under the bus. But I want us to just slow down for a minute and think about the generational progression that has actually gotten us to where we are today, that is priming us
Yeah.
to reclaim our identity as the people of God, as an identity of people who are rooted in connection. Right? So if we just go back to the beginning of the 20th century, right, the generation that grew up during the Great um,
Depression.
the Great Depression, World War I, where a lot of people talk about them as the greatest generation.
Mhm.
When you have a generation that is raised in the midst of global trauma, which is what the Great Depression was, which is what World War I does, when you have a generation that's raised in the midst of trauma, their orientation is not towards thriving, which is where we get connection and intimacy and breadth of life. their orientation is towards survival.
Mm-hmm.
When the orientation is towards survival, we're not thinking about love shaping identity, and we're not thinking about creating contexts of safety and building of trust. We're thinking about, how do I keep me and my family safe?
How do I feed them? How do I
Right? Real
protect
Maslow's
them? How do
hierarchy
they?
of need. This is like the bottom tier,
Yeah.
like, am I going to be shot in my bed tonight kind of stuff? Am I going to eat
Mm-hmm.
tomorrow? Are bombs going to be dropped on my city? That when you live in a context of trauma, you have a different orientation and a different perspective. So you have a generation that grew up in a collective trauma that didn't have a value for relational safety and love speaking identity, because it wasn't a part of their reality, because of the world in which they lived. And so they gave birth to a boomer generation that didn't live and grow up in a context of as much global trauma as they did. And there was more room for beginning to shift towards a framework of, how do we thrive in life? How do we maximize life? How do we build potential? How do we excel in things? And so you see in the baby boomer generation a ton of personal, professional growth,
Yeah, 60s,
businesses being
70s,
started,
80s.
a lot of the entrepreneur, the boom in this that really began to develop, the growth in our corporate structures and entities that really took off nationally, that had to do with growing and becoming better people. The framework that they had was very much about personal excellence and personal growth and thriving and widening and enhancing, which began the shift out of a survival framework and into a thriving framework, where there's room for more than just the question, do I have a place to sleep? Am I going to have something to eat? Will I live through the week? That there's room for more questions. There's room for more growth, which is a really important step. What most boomers still didn't have a lot of was a concept of needing to speak identity to children and
Mm-hmm.
fostering an environment of safety in which people can grow up.
So they got mentored in how to work hard, how to like provide for themselves, how to do all those things,
Mhm.
because that was necessary from their
Mhm.
parents, but not necessarily who are you,
Mhm.
who are you.
Right. And
Like,
so what we see then is Gen X.
so they got provided safety to a certain
Mhm.
degree, but not identity.
in the physical safety that was facilitated by the boomer generation.
Right. Physical.
Gen X grow. This is where the language of latchkey kids came in, is with Gen X.
Mm-hmm.
And going like, hey, have freedom, step into things, do things on your own, which began to speak towards some identity stuff. Began to think like, hey, you can do this, you can figure things out on your own. But what was absent in that move towards empowerment was actually the safety around side of it to support and protect it. But what we see in Gen X as a whole, I'm speaking in broad strokes,
Yes.
not including everyone in these, but just in the general shifts that we're seeing generationally. One of the things that I see that happened in Gen X, that grew up in an environment where they were encouraged to go find their way and to do their own things and kind of left to their own devices, but had an experience of physical safety by and large. What they became aware of is that emotions are a thing. That Gen X is really the first generation, when we look at the last handful, where emotions are at all a thing, and where anger became a thing, and frustration with the disappointment of coming home and having parents not be there. And so there began to become room for emotions of going, okay, if I'm going to thrive, if I'm going to step into a greater fullness of me, emotions are somewhere in here. But no one taught them what to do with it. No one gave them language for it. They had no idea what to do with it. So what then happened, and so the tail end of boomers in Gen X, is they became parents. What we see is they had a concept that said emotions are important. Mm-hmm. Emotions are real. Emotions matter. So most of us who were raised by parents who are late boomers, Gen X, were raised in often an environment that said feelings are real, have your feelings. But we were raised by parents who had no idea what to do with feelings. So the millennial generation is a generation that was empowered and given permission to have feelings. But then when they would have feelings, the Gen X and late boomer generation who didn't know what to do with them would freak out because now they're seeing and experiencing emotions from their kids that the parents have no idea what to do with, don't know how to handle, frankly, scare them because they don't know, will it end? Is this now the totality of life? No, we need to shut this down. And we see a generation of millennials that actually has what I call emotional whiplash, where they're told, go feel things. Nope, that's too much. Don't feel things. Go feel things. Nope, not that much. Feel that, but not that. In this like chaos of, can I feel? Can I not feel? Being encouraged to feel, but then getting chastised when when millennial generation chastised when what they were feeling freaks out their parents. And so you have this chaos that existed within this framework that a lot of the millennials experience, which when we look generationally, this is a really important progression because the millennials were the first generation that were really given permission to have feelings. That when we think culturally, they still weren't taught what to do with them. They often got in trouble when they had them, which creates a lot of confusion and a lot of hesitation. So you have a lot of millennials who are really,
I think some Gen Xers too.
In kind of the late Gen Xers, right? These are general.
Yeah, I know.
Broad,
it's
you can identify
brushstrokes.
Yep. I'm a millennial, but I have a boomer as a dad because I had a really old dad. And so there's always overlap and mixture in between. So what we see with late Gen Xers and with older millennial parents, one of the things that they've begun to do is to say, okay, emotions are really important. We need to pay attention to them, and we actually need to teach our kids how to do that. And if any of you have paid attention to parenting movements in culture, in the early millennial parenthood, late Gen X, we had what we culturally is identified as attachment parenting, this real pressure to make sure that all of your kids' feelings are attended to, that your kid doesn't get upset, that you don't ever let your kid cry because all of their injury needs to be supported. And we see this as a swing from kids who were raised up by parents who said, feel your feelings, and then they were just left totally on their own with their feelings, or were then shut down, to now you have parents who say, no, I didn't have care for my feelings. I need to make sure my kid has care. And they go all the way to the other end, and we're caring for everything. And we're making sure our kids don't ever hurt. And what that results in is kids who grow up not understanding adversity and not knowing how to handle negative experiences of emotion. So what I'm walking us through,
they don't know how to walk into personal responsibilities.
Right. Yeah. Because pain comes up. Now they need to be rescued from pain.
Right.
They don't actually know how to take responsibility for pain and find a way forward.
Can I just
yes.
So greatest generation, survival, just get things done. They teach their baby boomer kids, be personally responsible. You have to make a way for yourself. You have to be successful. They did a personal achievement, went to Gen X, who was like, and then they're like, oh wait, we have room and space for feelings now because there's a certain amount of thriving. It's not like we're just surviving. So, okay, so now we can start to feel things. And that's where like hippie cult, that was part of baby boomer, but going into out of Vietnam. So we're not sitting in wars all the time. And then we got to millennials, and they're growing up and they're like, oh yeah, feel your feelings, but then I don't know what to do with it. So here, let me give you something. And then now millennials are parents, and their attachment focus is like, let me make you not hurt ever. And so then we have kind of pansy. This is my own opinion, obviously. Like there's certain friends, I have close friends that I'm like, your kid hasn't fallen down. Like they need to learn what it feels like to get hurt. So there's trajectory of, we swing back and forth between the positive of feeling and processing emotion or not, and just shutting it down.
And what we see where we are right now is in the movement over the few generations toward a culture that wants to thrive. There's been a lot of emphasis in the last 10, 15 years put on this unconditional love, this identity. Let me make sure my kid doesn't hurt. I'm going to speak. This is where you have like family mantras of like, I'm strong, I'm brave, I'm right. Like, let me know my identity. Let's speak this over a kid, which is an incredible thing, which is a wonderful thing to be speaking identity over our kids. In the place that we're at right now actually has a lot to do with the safety piece that we've been talking about, because safety is not created in the avoidance of all things painful. Safety is actually found in helping teach our children how to be brave in the midst of difficult moments.
Say all that again.
Okay? Safety isn't found in the avoidance of pain in difficult circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
That safety is actually developed through learning how to be brave, how to be empowered to walk into difficult, uncomfortable, and even unsafe moments and find a strength to walk through that.
Yep.
So we've done great, in my opinion, of starting to develop language around love. And we see this in the church. And we've been talking about this a little bit. The language of love culturally is there. The speaking of identity culturally is there. The risk that we're running into, one of my pet peeves as a therapist is everyone's just going like, oh, I need to practice self-care. I need to go do self-care. I had a rough day. I'm going to go do self-care. And like, there's this immediate, like, I'm hurt. I'm going to pull back because who I am matters. And you don't get to speak that way to me. You're challenging my identity. And there is validity to boundaries, to being attentive to when people are hurting us and taking care of ourselves. But when the only thing that matters is the individual identity of the self, we will never create contexts and cultures and communities that have any safety, because as soon as unsafety arises and we don't know what to do with it, we double down on our identity. And either I'm better than you because I'm good enough and I've been told my whole life I'm good enough, so the issue must be you and I'm going to bail out. And we start to react in some of these ways, or we just go like, wait, I thought I was loved and I'm good enough, and why does no one care about me? And we kind of go the other end and like need people to come pick us up and rub our head and pat our back, and we get stuck there, right? And it isn't that either of those are inherently a bad thing, but if all we have is a culture that speaks identity and we don't have a culture that leans into safety, we're going to end up with what a lot of people critique, the later millennial side of the generation. And like culturally, we have a whole lot of people talking smack about that. And they're like, everyone gets a participation trophy and nobody feels bad. And the truth, the beautiful thing is that's identity building, right? Yeah. That's about love, right, and building care about an identity. What it completely missed was this empowerment to find and build safety and walk through hard things. And so I'm drawing this to our attention because the temptation we have is to look at what the last generation missed and throw out what they did in reaction against it because of what they missed. And when we look culturally over the last 100 years, every generation is building on itself and is opening up more space for thriving and for connection in intimacy, in deep connection that we believe is the foundational fabric of our theology, right? That Jesus entered into relationship with people for connection, that God could have rescued humanity from sin by like staying in heaven and like doing some magic work in earth. And he came down into relationship because connection and intimacy matter. And we're actually at a place culturally that is begging for someone to put the pieces together, that we have one piece around this love that has been, the drum has been beaten on for 15 years, perhaps to an extreme, but the reaction against it needs to not be to push it against, but to bring the other piece that says, yes, this matters. Freedom of choice matters. Who you are matters. Yes, so does the context that you're in. So do the relationships that you're a part of, that yes, they impact you, but you impact them. And we need to talk about the relational side, the communal side, and the responsibility we have to that. So from a generational perspective, we are at an incredibly opportune time to bring that puzzle piece, in together in a way that opens people to encountering the kingdom of God in ways that they're desperately looking for.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Is this making sense? Okay, cool.
I just keep seeing Aaron going like, yeah.
Good. So, so where we're at is in this, I believe that in order to go here to this is the concern. This is what we have access to in society. To get there, we're going to need a different kind of leadership. Because change always requires leadership. There is no change without leadership. The change doesn't just happen spontaneity. Like if I want my kids to grow, I got to help them grow. Modification can happen without leadership. People will try on some different things, but true change is always, there's always leadership involved.
Well, even within a peer group, you have a leader and things shift because of that person. So there's always going to be leadership.
And so I want to offer to you the suggestion that the leadership that the next era of our society needs, and this isn't just about church, but this is about society. And I think that the church can be a solution for society in a way that it hasn't been in decades, is that the leadership that our society needs is not an organizational leadership, is not a power leadership, but is a parental leadership. And this is where I want to go. Thinking about it, I read the Mr. Rogers quote, I think a couple of trainings ago, where he said, from the time you were very little, you've had people who smiled you into smiling, people who have talked you into talking, sung you into singing, and loved you into loving. That there was someone who did it with you and showed you how to do it and walked alongside of you while you learned to do it too. And he's talking about parenting. Like, this is core to what a good parent does, that we walk our children into the very things that we long for them, that we do with them the skills that we want them to develop, that we talk about it and we show them and we model it for them. And this to me actually sounds a lot like the kind of discipleship that Jesus did with his disciples, where he walked with them, that he didn't just sit and teach them, but he did things with them. One of my personal thoughts, this is not, I'm not going to claim theological grounding on this, but one of my personal suspicions is that one of the reasons Jesus did miracles wasn't just for the people who were receiving the miracles, but he needed a context to do discipleship in. And Jesus, in part of this, I just believe that Jesus is like, how am I going to teach these people the power of God? Okay, I need to create some moments where we experience it, where we do it together, where we walk into it. And so part of the whole point of miracles and of feeding 5,000 people was to create experiences for his disciples to come into together. And I think this concept of experiential modeling and experiential leadership is really significant, that if we think about like the feeding of the 5,000 as Jesus just doing something for the 5,000, so Jesus is putting on a show for people to come and consume. Yeah, we can think about it that way. Or we could think about it of going, Jesus had an opportunity to allow his disciples to participate in the graciousness and generosity of God, in the capacity of God to do a lot with a little. And he literally put the fish in his disciples' hands and goes, go start pulling it apart. Yeah. Like experiential, like in the moment, like Jesus walked his disciples into experiences of the generosity of God. He didn't just teach about it. He walked them and modeled them into it.
I don't think it was an or, I think it's an and.
Yes.
Like
exactly.
Like he cared about the 5,000, yes. But then he's like, oh, opportunity, yes, to teach my,
yes, yeah, yes. Thank you. Because you
said a hard or.
I did not intend a hard.
I know
or.
You didn't, so I was just clarifying that.
I was holding two frames of ways of seeing that. Anyways, so I want to invite us as we think about leadership, and as we're starting to think about this parental concept of leadership, to lean back into the family metaphor that the New Testament is filled with. That this is one of the primary metaphors used to talk about the people of God as the family of God. Paul uses this language all over the place. Mm-hmm. The risk that we run is most of us have mixed experience with family. To probably say it kindly, many of us have really painful experiences with family. That the idea of someone being a father or being a mother, we might actually recoil at the thought of that being something that someone would try to do, that would be a power that someone would go into for us. And this is true in our society, that our society doesn't inherently embrace the language of family or the concept of family, because there's been so much dysfunction in the family. So what I want to invite us to do as leaders is to think about parental leadership and to think about family of church as a posture, and as a posture of the heart, not as a role, not as an authority, not as a title. Because if we aren't careful, we will start using parental language, but revert right back to power hierarchical structures that have been abused. So we want to use some family language as a way out of some of those constructs, but we're going to need to be careful or we will loop right back around into them and do the same thing with new language, which is what our society gets mad at the church for doing a lot of.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're talking about family and when we're talking about parental leadership, I say parental leadership because I start to say parenting and then I add leadership. And so you just get
like
parental leadership. You're going to hear me talk a lot about the posture of our heart toward that. And I think that as we think about our communities in developing bonding and connection and life together, thinking about the posture of a family and what that means, and that all families are comprised of a lot of different kinds of things, a lot of different kinds of roles. And even if we're thinking about parent-child dynamics, that doesn't all mean the same thing. Mm-hmm. That in families, you have biological children, you have adopted children, you have foster children, and foster children come in with a whole bunch of baggage that you had nothing to do with, but you are going to get the results of. Mm-hmm. You have, and some stay a long time, and some stay too long. And some don't stay long enough for you to actually help. And so when we think about the parent-child dynamic, we're thinking in all of those forms, not just I birthed this child into existence and I'm walking them through, but we inherit other people's children, that we foster other people's children, that we adopt other people's children, that this is the posture of our heart. And those all have different moments. So I would encourage you to even be thinking about the people you've walked with along the way. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes we get really bitter when we invest and we care and we almost take a parental posture towards people and then they bail before we really had a chance to live out the fruit of that relationship. Mm-hmm. That's because some of these people who come into our lives are our foster kids, that we are a season of their life to give them a different experience before they walk on into their own way. Some of those become our adopted children. We welcome into a permanence and family. But this also is important because at some point we all hope that our children grow up and leave the house, that keeping our kids at home permanently is actually a little bit dysfunctional in a lot of ways. And there's room for a lot of different cultural expressions, right? And you have some that are multi-generational. Absolutely. This isn't against any of that. Mm-hmm. But as every culture, regardless of how communal or nuclear you are, every culture has demarcation points where children enter adulthood and become their own families. And they keep different dynamics within the existing family system, but there's a growth, there's an extending. And one of the things that we don't do well as a church in America is actually letting people grow up and leave. Yeah. And part of that is the structures that we create within our organizations that are rooted in some of the ways that we think and use money in construct, that now we have people, because the more established and mature, the more financially stable they are, which is the greatest asset to the church that we have. And then we create these organizations that are now dependent upon the stability of grownups. But then if we release them to have our own family, now we have all sorts of questions that we need to be answered. So, and this isn't a knock against that.
No,
this is something for us to be attentive to and to be thinking about.
Yeah, it's the reality of what church has looked like, but also I think that never mind.
Half a thought that didn't fully form.
Yeah, I just don't think you're gonna go that direction. So I'm pausing. Cool.
I appreciate that.
He's got an agenda. So
there's so much I want to say in so little time. Yep. So hopefully this makes sense and is coherent in y'all's mind. As we start to think about church community and the family as a posture of family, it opens up room for there to be aunts and uncles, for there to be parents, for there to be children, for there to be siblings, different kinds of siblings. If your family does a family night, I'd imagine that at some point your kids bring a friend by, and that kid isn't your kid. That kid is just like the family friend that just shows up, and there's a different relational dynamic and you have different expectations of. And this kind of language and framework can be really helpful as you're pastoring, and you're going to find yourself in so many different relational dynamics with the people in your community. And if you are thinking of them as like, this is my biological child and I have this responsibility toward them and I have this expectation of them, but they're actually like your kid's friend. And so they're not buying that whole responsibility back to you piece, and they're just kind of showing up for the pizza you have and the ping pong that's in your garage, and then they're out, and you expect them to engage you as your kid, there's all sorts of room for pain and resentment and bitterness to fester. And so having permission in our minds to be thinking in ways of different relational dynamics as we develop the posture of our hearts. Um,
Can I just say, like, so like right now we are not senior pastoring as we used to, but we are literally, we're like, it was funny. So the senior pastors that we are helping and consulting with, they're like, what do you guys think yourself as, like, in our church? And we're like, we think of ourselves as like an aunt and uncle, like that. When you can't talk to your parents because it's a little intimidating or there's just too many dynamics go on, you go to like your aunt and uncle and like, hey, can I talk about what's going on? And the parents then talk to their sibling, the aunt and uncle, hey, can I talk to you about what's going on? And so it's needed to have all those dynamics. And so as you plant your church, you probably will function more so as the mom and dad in that space. But like right now, you might be an aunt and uncle in your community, or you might be a little bit of both. You like if you're functioning within a certain ministry, you might be mom and dad to your youth ministry, but then you're an aunt and uncle to the rest of the congregation. And so it's not like this, like this is like the posture, the position or title that I hold. It's more of where in your space are you posturing yourself with those expectations and in parenting people.
And every if you've had experience with extended family, you know that there are some things an aunt or uncle can tell you that your parents can't tell you. There are certain things you will hear from different types of family relationships that you will. And some of us have different experiences with aunts and uncles and cousins, right? But some of us know, like, oh yeah, like I have a godparent that can sit me down and have a conversation that I'll listen to. But if my dad sat me down and had a conversation, I'm all sorts of like mad at him for lecturing me. And we actually, for a family to be healthy, we need a lot of these different relational dynamics to be present for a family to be healthy.
Yeah.
And I'll say this, families, the family as an entity can just happen, right? Someone sleeps with someone, baby comes out, now you have a family. Families can just happen. Healthy families do not.
No.
Healthy families require significant parental attentiveness. That even in the fostering of all of the different roles, aunts, uncles, godparents, extended family, cousins, it still needs parental leadership to develop the health of that family. That children can't make their families healthy. Aunts and uncles can't make the family environment healthy for the kids of their siblings. That the parents set the tone for the health in a family system.
What do you mean by parental attentiveness?
So when we think about parenting, a lot of the work that I do with parents is learning to become connection conscious parents. And this is really important language, and we could spend a whole lot more time talking about connection conscious. That one of the decisions that every parent has to wrestle with is my goal to dictate behavior, or is my goal to form connection in which my child can grow and thrive? Because the way that we go about doing those two things is actually often in opposition to each other. That connection attentive parenting has to do with, is my child connected to me? Does my child feel safe with me? Right? So connection attentive parenting has everything to do with love and with safety. Am I fostering those two things? Am I attentive to my own reliability and openness and fairness within the family? Am I attentive to the way that I'm speaking love and belonging and value over my children? Because by and large, this isn't exclusive and there's always counterexamples, but by and large, the vast majority of children's reactivity happens in the context of disconnection. That sometimes it's disconnection because a parent says no, and now the kid is like, wah! And now they're reacting, but there's a moment of disconnection that occurs. And part of, as parents, learning to be attentive to, this is a moment where I disconnected from my kid, right? So maybe I was zoning out on my phone and my kid was trying to get my attention, and now my kid threw something against the wall. Yeah, I could get mad at my kid for doing a behavior that was inappropriate, but that behavior was actually rooted in the disconnection that I started. And so I can reorient that, right? Or like being corrected or being pushed back against creates an experience of disconnection that can be jarring for a kid, and helping them walk through that to refine that connection. So there's a lot of different ways of parenting that are connection conscious parenting, as opposed to what some of us were raised in, which is more of like a shame power framework of just being like, don't make mistakes, or we're going to punish you if you did. In connection conscious parenting is not void of consequences, is not void of kind of those the ramifications of poor choices and behaviors, just for the record, because some
Right.
people will hear that and
Well,
go
and
all the
the
way the other
swing,
way.
the swing would be that you don't have any, like they're just
Do whatever
leaving.
you
Yeah,
want, which also isn't, as we've been talking, is not safe, and you're not
Right.
attentive to connection if you're just kind of like do whatever you want. So part of that, and we can talk and we can do follow-up coaching for those that are really interested in diving into some connection conscious parenting as a framework.
Yeah.
But one thing I want to say, and then I want to talk about actually how to shift into this parental posture. That when we're thinking about family and we're thinking about church and we're thinking about leadership, taking a parental posture as a leader is not mutually exclusive from the idea of shared leadership, right? So this isn't just another version of saying, I'm just going to find a new way of saying I'm at the top of the pyramid. What we're recognizing is even shared leadership needs to be developed and needs to be empowered. That most of the time when you get a bunch of people together, they don't know how to share leadership. And even that has to be talked through and worked on and experienced together. And so a phrase that I want to give you, and this is a phrase that I use with my therapist a lot in figuring out how do we honor relationships in which I'm taking what can feel like a power position, like a parental position, almost like this one-up position. In the phrase that I use a lot is mutual, but not equal. In the sense that we can, in our family system, in a healthy family, there is mutuality in the relationships, right? There's a recognition that like what my kids do impacts me. Like when my kids are doing well, it brings joy to me. And when my kids aren't doing well, it brings sorrow to me. That when my kids are fighting and they're mad at each other, yeah, I get sucked into it. There is a mutuality of a shared experience.
Well, yeah, and the same as if you're happy, your kids might feel happy because man, like mom's really happy today.
Right.
Like,
yep.
So that's the mutual part.
But mutual does not mean equal in the sense that everyone has the same voice, because my 2-year-old does not get to dictate all of the rhythms of our life. That would actually be developmentally inappropriate. However, when my 2-year-old is 13, our family better be having some different conversations that gives more space for that 13-year-old's voice.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that you see is as your kid grows, there's appropriate levels of participation, that there's always mutuality, but the level of empowerment and participation in the weight of voice grows as our maturity grows. Right? And one of the dysfunctions that we can see in church is there are churches that have emotional children that have an outside voice in the decisions that are made in those church structures. Yeah. And most of us know what that feels like when you're sitting and going like, that person ought not to have that voice. And by and large, that's often because they are emotionally and relationally children and they need to be parented, and they've been put into a position of being aunt or uncle or parent
because
and
of
they're
their age
not.
Or because of their financial contribution or because of their just keep going, right?
Okay.
Like
yes. So the whole paradigm that we're talking, that the whole big picture, and we're going to talk all about all of it, but I think that there are 3 shifts that the church as a whole really needs to make moving into the future that all have to do with a family posture. One is that we need to embrace spiritual parenthood. And this is the one that I'm going to talk about how to do this in a minute. The second one is actually we need to embrace spiritual childhood. That I don't think we do a very good job in our communities of giving people permission to be children, to develop, to get messy, to make mistakes, to try on some things, to throw some fits, to push back on things that actually, if they were literally 2 or 5 or 7, we would look at that behavior and go like, yeah, that makes sense. You're a kid. You're trying to figure out their way.
30 and doing it, we have a different
then we go like, oh no, you should be doing something different. But spiritually, they might be babies. Right? We have this language in scripture, right, about babies and growing in and drinking milk and eating meat. Like we have this language, but we don't actually own it in our communities. And so we need to shift to embrace spiritual parenthood. We also need to shift to embrace spiritual childhood. And if we can do that, it will also allow us to shift to embrace spiritual siblingship.
Okay, so 1, spiritual parenthood, 2, spiritual childhood, 3, spiritual siblinghood.
Where we actually teach people how to be siblings with each other. Because one of the challenges that we find is as people start to grow up, they immediately try to become parents and step into power because our church processes move us into positions of power, and we skip right over actually learning how to be siblings, which is a fundamental developmental step in our family systems. Right, that this is one of the challenges that those of us who have families where there's really young pregnancies that occur, that one of the things that are robbed of our young people who get pregnant really young is they don't have the opportunity to fully form sibling experiences and sibling relationships, and they get thrust right into a parental dynamic that they're not actually equipped and ready for. That actually part of what can equip us to be good parents is we know how to be siblings, because when we become parents, we need some siblings in the trenches with us who are also becoming parents that we can bitch and moan with together, because parenting is freaking hard. And this whole developmental process is what we need to do. So I'm not going to talk about the second two. That is for another time. We can do coaching on any of this stuff that you're interested in.
I'm just going to say it again in case you didn't take it down. Spiritual parenthood, becoming spiritual parents, becoming spiritual children, and becoming spiritual siblings.
And these are three shifts that I think as a church as a whole, we need to embrace and we need to lean into. And if we do, the impact we can have on our culture is profound, because our culture and our society is screaming for family. Not in the way that they've experienced it, not in the way that it's often portrayed, but man, if we as the people of God could become God's family, to truly posture ourselves in a way that isn't about power, but is about connection, our world would just roll right into that and join us because they're desperate for it. Okay. And yeah.
Just take a breath.
Take a breath.
Yep.
Cool.
You're talking real fast and it's real good.
I know.
It's real good, but just take a breath.
Someday I'll email you all my book.
It's all right. You're gonna.
So it's in process, but it's just not there yet. We actually made 2 attempts to create a flattened leadership structure. One was in the church that Michelle took over as a senior pastor, who came from really severe top-down control, rigid power.
I thought I could do it because I was a young woman and I had people who were older than me. I'm like, let's just make it equal, because you already see me as not equal to yourself. So I was like, let's just go there. But they didn't go there.
But in a leadership vacuum, people do a couple different things. One, they take advantage of the vacuum and take power for themselves. Or 2, they take advantage of there not being leadership and just check out altogether and become really ambivalent quasi consumers and don't actually participate in the process, right? Which is awful. So we tried to take a power structure and shift it flat. And everyone got mad and hated it because they were all children and didn't know how to be siblings. And so we wanted to be siblings with them, and everyone just felt disoriented, lost, or then there was all sorts of power struggles and fights in fighting, and it was a disaster. When we planted our church, we also tried to create it as a flat church and sat around in a circle and collectively discern things and try to process things together.
That only lasted like 2 months.
That lasted 2 months because we just kept watching everyone just staring at us and realized that they don't actually know what to do. They don't actually know how to think about things. They don't even know what the options are.
Right.
So to ask someone, hey, what do you want to do, or how do you want to do it, assumes that they have a list of ideas that are options for them. But if someone hasn't grown into childhood and even learned, like if I ask like my daughter, like, hey, of all the things you could do, what do you want to play? We know that for a 2-year-old, that's too many choices. But they can't process all of that, which is why sometimes you get a kid and like stares at a wall of all the toys and is like, just goes and grabs one and then throws it and grabs the next and throws it. And they're like, want to do it all. And you don't actually get movement, you get chaos. That at some point, someone has to be parental and move people into that. And so we fought against it. We didn't want to be community parents because it sounds awful and responsible and too heavy and really messy. And it is all of those things. And then we just had to accept that if we weren't going to be parents, our community was never going to grow.
We didn't call ourselves parents at that point, but we postured ourselves going, okay, well, we still have to take this leadership role. We still have to, okay, so they don't know how to connect yet. So I think you shared in coaching conversation last week.
Yeah, a little bit.
But just like there was 2 people and one person was like, they don't like me. Everyone hates me. And Brian James was like, have you talked to them? And she's like, no. Well, then how do you know that they actually, so like we literally had to
Walk them
parent
through. How do you
them
have that
into having
conversation?
connection with one another.
Mhm.
And that's a common,
Yep.
common
Yep.
occurrence.
So probably the most important thing in all of this that I'm talking about is that parental leadership is a posture, not a title, not a position, not a role, not power, not something you claim over people, not something you speak to people, not something that you officially and formally take, because you have no idea what their experience with parents is.
Right.
And you take a formal official power position over someone, for most of our society today, that creates the very unsafe experience that we're trying to work against. So this is a posture of the heart toward other people. And I'll tell you, it is much harder to be parental in posture than it is to be parental in role. Because when I'm parental in role, everyone knows that I'm the parent, and I can claim it and I can own it and I can say, because dad says so. And there's some places where we get to do some of that stuff to catch yourself a break. I'm not saying that's a great thing to do. I'm just saying it's accessible. When we are taking a parental posture of the heart, hold on, I want to read this. Someone asked a question. Yep, I'm going to talk. Josh and Mike, are you talking about what I mean by posture? You asked practically. Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, when you're in the posture, but not the. Can you just kind of explain?
Yes.
If you're all sitting, like, what does that look like?
So
church plant.
So what it means is some of the things, and I'm going to talk about 3 key components to the parental posture. But functionally, what it means is we own that we're parents, which means that we take responsibility. It means that we are showing up. It means that we hold other people, and that we posture ourselves to be prepared to do that. It means that we are viewing people from a developmental standpoint, that we aren't expecting everyone to be peers, that we aren't expecting people to do what we do, that the posture of our heart says, I'm probably going to need to walk you into some of these things. So we're looking for those moments, right? The reason it's a posture is I got some 40-year-olds who have some real pain, and 50-year-olds who don't have good fathers and good mothers. And there are moments that they actually need me to sit down with them and have a fatherly conversation where I just kind of hold them together and say, okay, this is a moment where we're going to have to be brave together. This is what that looks like. Can we do it together? Right? These moments that they're not going to instigate the step that is needed, that the parent is going to need to recognize and step in and help instigate that moment. And so there's a responsibility that we carry as parents. It doesn't mean that we're always active and we step into everything, but there's an attentiveness that comes with that and a responsibility. And I think as I talk through part of the journey here, I think it'll make a little bit more sense as we do that.
I think you should jump into that.
So I'm going to jump in in the work that I'm doing, the language that I use is to become spiritual parents. I think that there are actually 3 mountains that we need to summit. So this is the language that I'm using, and I'm going to walk us through tonight. The first is the mountain of responsibility. The second is the mountain of vulnerability. And the third is the mountain of empathy. Okay. So the first mountain that to take the posture of a parent, to take the posture of a spiritual parent. And I would say this is true of like parenting in the flesh with our kids too. It applies, but I'm really focusing on becoming parental parents in posture. Is the first mountain that we must summit is the mountain of responsibility. The second is the mountain of vulnerability. And the third is the mountain of empathy. I had a friend of mine who, when her kid was 3, she had this moment where she was downstairs in the kitchen and her 3-year-old was upstairs in the bathroom. He had just been potty training, so he was on the toilet going to the bathroom, and she heard him like freaking out, mom, 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 just like screaming from the bathroom. And so she like, oh my gosh, did he fall in the toilet? Like all the things you imagine when a 3-year-old is screaming in the bathroom. So mom goes running up the stairs. The door is closed. Mom is really worried, really eager. And so she grabs the doorknob and she opens the door, having no idea that her 3-year-old had climbed off the toilet, had walked right behind the door and was standing right behind the door with his forehead at doorknob level. And mom, in eagerness to come help kid, opened the doorknob smack into his forehead. Kid starts crying and screaming. And of course, because it hurt, it's scared, he cried out for help. Mom came in and smashed him in the head. So he starts saying things like, "You did this on purpose. You meant to hurt me. You hate me. Why did you hurt me?" Like going off and blasting mom, right? This is a moment that as the mother experienced the reactivity of her son who was in pain, it actually brought up her own pain, right? This kid is falsely accusing her, is grossly misunderstanding her, and has no picture of the greater perspective of what's actually happening in the world.
Yeah.
And he is just leveling it on mom. And all of us as parents will have these moments where one of the people that we are mentoring with, walking with, gets into a reaction and lays it back on us. These are moments that will always trigger our pain, right? Whether it's our own experiences of being left unprotected, the pain of being accused, something untrue being spoken over us, or even our own feelings of failure as a parent, right? Whatever is on our pain cycle, those are the kinds of moments where that shows up, right? This isn't fair. You don't know the whole story. Why are you blaming me? In this first part of our journey in becoming spiritual parents and taking the posture, in this mountain of responsibility is to take responsibility for our own pain. And this is the work that we've been doing as we've talked about the pain cycle, because in that moment, right, as that mom opened the door on our kid's forehead and the kid blasted mom, there's a whole lot of moments where that mom is ready to get defensive, trying to explain, to justify, to be like, "No, you don't understand me. That wasn't what I intended. Mom doesn't hate you." All of that defensiveness and explaining is rooted in mom's own pain, right? Of feeling misunderstood, of being mischaracterized, of having something unjust said about them, that there's that reactivity. And the first part of taking responsibility is to be able to own, oh yeah, this is a moment where I feel the injustice of this. I feel the failure of this. I feel whatever my pain is, to take responsibility and to own that so that I'm not reacting out of my pain to my kid's reaction. In taking responsibility for our own pain, there's a particular practice, and actually I would say a spiritual discipline, that I think to truly take on the posture of parents that we're all going to have to do at some point, and that's the spiritual practice of lament. And what lament is a acknowledgement of the injustice that has been present in our own lives. Right. And the distinction between grief and lament, and grief gets pulled into lament, but grief is mourning something that was lost. Lament is often mourning something that ought to have been that never was. So there are moments as we are parenting that our own pain gets triggered. And that is akin to moments in our lives where someone else was supposed to parent us in that moment and they never did. And now I'm in this moment as a parent being asked to do something that was never done for me, and that's not fair. That is something that each of us is going to have to lament, is going to have to grieve, and going to have to mourn in practice of owning the injustice that we've walked through that is going to get kicked up for us, because it is inherently unfair to take responsibility for others in ways that no one ever took for us.
Well, I mean, if we're not going to survey right now with you guys, but if we think about how many of us have actual spiritual parents, I would assume that at least half of us don't. And so then we're taking on this responsibility to become spiritual parents to others. We're going to have to lament that no one ever did that to me. I mean, I can say that about my own journey. No one ever walked with me in that space. And yet now I'm responsible to do that for someone else. Okay, I gotta let that go. I gotta lament and walk into this journey because it didn't happen, but this is what God is calling me to.
Because our failure to lament the things that we did not receive are some of the things that cause us to lose our patience with people who are still in pain, who are not developing fast enough, because we didn't have people who were patient with us and walked with us slowly and pressured us or pushed us. That all of those things that we did not receive that are now being asked of us, those all deserve to be honored and lamented and mourned. Because there are things that ought to have been done for us. None of us should have had to raise ourselves. None of us should have had to grow into spiritual maturity on our own and overcome our pain on our own. That all of us, if we're in the family of God, we ought to have had these experiences. And as you are pastoring others, if you choose to take a posture as a parent toward others, that experience of injustice is going to show up, because you're going to be doing things that there weren't people to do that for you, or aren't even people to do that for you. And that needs to be lamented and mourned. The second part of this taking responsibility is actually, when you think about the story where this mom opened door on son's forehead, she was presented with a dilemma. And the dilemma that she was presented with was whether to defend herself against her kid's anger or to reestablish connection. Right? And to reestablish connection with her kid actually meant that she took responsibility for everything, fair or not. Right? That this is taking responsibility for the pain of her son, even though she knows, like, that was not my intent. I wasn't trying to do that. In a sense that we know as parents that there are times that we fall on our sword on behalf of our kids because they can't understand the bigger picture enough for us to explain it to them. Right? So if this mom doesn't, right, if she doesn't take responsibility, if she doesn't own, be like, oh my gosh, you are right. Like, I opened this into your forehead and I hurt you. Like, that is on me. You were crying for help, and instead of help, I hurt you. Like, that is unfair. That wasn't kind. Like that's on me. I am in owning it, right? If mom doesn't take responsibility, what ends up happening is the child's development begins to stall. The child begins to lose their sense of safety because what they experience is, mom's not going to protect me. I now need to protect myself. And the trust of that parent begins to erode because the parent wasn't taking responsibility for needing to be that protector. And in a stage of development where a child is supposed to be exploring, supposed to be taking risks, supposed to be pushing boundaries, when they start to begin to assess risk and lean into self-preservation, learn that others can't be trusted, this actually stalls out their development. And in order to remobilize the development of that children, sometimes that means that parents take ownership of things that are not actually theirs to own, so that the pain can be cared for, so that the situation can be de-escalated, and so that connection can be restored.
And so the child can grow.
And so that the child can grow, because children grow in the context of connection. Once connection is established, we get to have lots of conversations that we can't have when there isn't connection, right? Depending on the developmental age of our kid, right? So if our 10 or 12-year-old gets really hurt by something that happened, and we start by de-escalating and we start by reestablishing connection, once the connection is reestablished, we now get to have a lot of conversations with a 10 or 12-year-old about what actually happened and help them see different perspectives. If we start there out of our own pain, we actually decrease the safety of the relationship with the parent. And this is the same thing with the people in our community, that when pain shows up, our tendency, one, is to protect ourselves, whatever our pain showed up in. Two, is help them understand how this all fits into the big picture. And what we need to do is to start by reestablishing connection. And in order to reestablish connection, sometimes that means we choose to take responsibility for things that aren't actually our responsibility, because that opens up access to connection from which a whole lot of growth happens. Okay? So for each of these, I'm going to give you a relational and emotional skill, and then I'm going to give you a spiritual practice. So this journey, this mountain of responsibility,
Relational emotional skill.
a relational emotional skill that I think is critical that we develop, and then a spiritual practice that is critical for us to engage in for each of these parts of the journey. So for this mountain of responsibility, the relational emotional skill is honest self-reflection and acceptance. Being able to be honest with moments that hurt, why they hurt, and why we're making the choices we're making is critical so that we don't put stuff on our spiritual children that they can't handle. Being able to honestly say, this isn't mine to own, I'm owning it on their behalf, and it's going to hurt me, and I'm counting that cost. Being able to be honest and accept that is critical in order to actually be able to establish that connection authentically and truly. And then the spiritual practice is the one that I talked about, a lament, because most of us did not receive everything that we need for this journey. And that's not fair. We ought to have. And many of us are being asked to parent in ways that we weren't parented and to give things we did not receive. There's some need for lament in those spaces. Okay, so that is the first mountain, and I am going to do just a real quick blitz through the second two. Okay. Because I know that we're at time and I have been throwing content at you for quite some time, and eyes are about to glaze over if they're not already, which is not, I don't experience that as dishonoring at all. So I'll just go really, really quickly. So that first shift in that posture, the first mountain is that responsibility for my pain and choosing to take it for your pain, even if it isn't mine. We need Jesus. We need to lament. We need to be able to be honest about those moments. The second mountain that we need to climb is the mountain of vulnerability. And in the conversation, in that story of mom opening door on kid's head, what I'm meaning by vulnerability is the capacity to look at our children and say, I hurt you. I did it. To be able to be vulnerable about the pain that we are complicit in. The way vulnerability is often used from the pulpit right now is saying, these are places that I hurt. These are places that maybe I'm hurting. This is wounds that have been healed. That is really wonderful and helpful. But from a parental posture, what is transformative is when a parent looks at a child and goes, that's on me, right? That pain that you're experiencing, that's not your fault. Like, daddy made a mistake. Daddy opened that door into your head. You wanted help, and I did that. Being able to be vulnerable about our complicitness in the pain that others are experiencing, whether we intended to or not, whether we think it's valid or not, right? And this is where that mountain of responsibility comes in, because we're going to have to lament some of this stuff. And like, that's a hard thing to be responsible. When we can be responsible, we can now lean in and take ownership and be able to be honest and say, you know, daddies aren't supposed to hurt their kids. I'm really sorry that I did that. That pain you're feeling, like, that's my fault. When we do that, we create a context where kids actually feel more permitted to say, mommy, you hurt me. Daddy, you hurt me. And instead of the kid taking that pain and isolating with it, trying to figure out how to preserve themselves, they now begin to bring that to the parent. And now we can comfort them. Now we can reestablish connection. And now we can help them learn, when things hurt, what do they do? How do they navigate those moments? And it starts with a parental vulnerability, not just about stories of our own lives. Those can be helpful, but about these moments that we recognize, I hurt you. Yeah.
So as we're thinking about what emotional age would a child be to own that responsibility and own that vulnerability and own that the empathy portion, I think, and we can do this in coaching conversations this month too, but I think that a child who is young, they just need to know that you've taken responsibility, that they're safe, they're covered. Empathy will be more of a ladder. Like, you got to have some abstract thinking, reasoning involved. And the middle one of vulnerability, of like, I hurt you, that's what actually allows a kid to open up to allow empathy into their heart. And so if we think about our own children, we think about people in our church, there may be people who are in our age that are older than us that they never had any of these things happen for them from their own parents. And so they may be 50 years old, but emotionally they're 3. And so I think that's something to think about, is like, how old emotionally are they? I know Brian James did this for me when we were at New Heart. I had she was like 60-year-old woman, and she kept calling me girl. And she's like, so girl, who are you? What do you? And she's like, I think she had some mental issues too, but like, she treated me like
Awful.
terribly and demeaned me every single week that she was there.
And you had all sorts of reactions
I
to
had
her.
so many reactions, but I'm like, this is a 6-year-old Black woman that I do not want to get on the wrong side of, and I want to respect, and I want to do the right thing. And Brian James just said, how old does she feel emotionally? And I go, oh, like 4. And he goes, well, then you need to talk to her like a 4-year-old. And so the next week I went up to her and I was like, hey, you know, it's not okay when you say girl to me. Like, I am the pastor of this church, and I never hold that posture. Like, I never say that stuff. Like, I am like, we're equal. Like, I was trying to like set a equal church, but I'm like, you need to respect me. And so I had to say these things because emotionally she was 4. She responded beautifully.
Because 4-year-olds need to know where the boundaries are.
Exactly. They need to know. And so I think that will be really helpful as you're thinking through these things that Brian James is saying, like, how old are they emotionally? Because that will dictate whether you're going to be more of a spiritual parent, whether you're going to try to teach spiritual siblinghood, or
all of it.
Does that make sense? So I'll let you go there.
Yeah. So vulnerability is critical because it creates opportunity for repair. All of us get hurt. All of us get hurt by other people. Not all of us have the opportunity to find repair of that hurt with the person who hurt us. And man, when we do have that opportunity, that is a profound experience that opens us up to relationship. It opens us up to trusting God in different ways when we have experiences of repair. And the culture of setting a culture of safety in which repair for pain can happen is fundamentally connected to the parents' willingness to be vulnerable about moments that they have hurt their people. I got people in my office all the time who talk about the way that pastors have hurt them. It is hard when I sit with pastors and I ask them, how have you hurt your people? Like, pastors go like, what are you talking about? Like, I love my people. I'm like, no, I'm not arguing that. Like, I'm not pushing. I know you love your people. Like, this mom loves her son. That's why she ran up the stairs to the bathroom, because she loved her son.
Coaching conversation,
right?
How have you hurt people?
Right?
Like, how have you been unsafe?
And her well-meaning intention to offer help hurt her son. And that's something that happens for all of us at different moments. And our ability to be vulnerable about that opens up repair. So the emotional relational skill that we need to develop in practicing vulnerability, in this posture of vulnerability, is emotional honesty. And when I say emotional honesty, I mean specific honesty. Not like, yeah, I know I hurt you. Like, that doesn't do anything. To someone who's hurting and needs to be acknowledged and say, yeah, I get that I hurt you. I don't know. It's I realize that when I did this, it really hurt you. Like, I realized that when I said this, it landed this way. Like actual specific honesty about the emotional pain. Like, specific is the key. So the spiritual practice is confession. James 5:16 tells us that it says, confess your sins one to another that you may be healed. Right? We confess our sins to God for forgiveness and for salvation. We confess our sins to one another for healing. And one of the things, if we are going to be healthy, sustainable parents, we have to be able to sit with other parents and own the places that we jacked it up. We have to be able to own the places that we've hurt our children. And so that we have some camaraderie with other parents in that, but we also have to learn to be able to confess that to our children, because that will create environments of safety when children are aware in developmentally appropriate ways, that we can talk forever about that. But that creates context of safety, because I think that most of us can call to mind an experience with a leader where we have been hurt, where that leader does not acknowledge, will not acknowledge, is not capable of acknowledging it. And we walk around with that hurt. And we can imagine how powerful it might be if that leader sat us down and said, hey, I want you to know that I see it. Like, I really messed that up. I missed the boat on that. I really hurt you. And how profound that would be. Whether relationship is ever restored or not, it does something to the pain when the person who has done the hurting acknowledges it, and the parent set the tone for the family on that. The pastor set the tone for the congregation, the community on that.
Well, we had someone who was my leader did that to us. It was like 2 years later. But they came up in the middle of a conference and was like, he's like, I was searching for you guys because God told me like I jacked it up, like I messed up, and so I had to come find you. And he just like confessed to us, and we're like, whoa, like, and we had processed through and like we'd gotten some healing, but the complete healing didn't happen until he was able to own that he hurt us.
And it created safety in the relationship in a way that had been damaged by the pain. So the third mountain that I think we really need to climb to find that posture of parental leadership is the mountain of empathy. And what I mean by the mountain of empathy is the ability to sit with someone and say, I see your hurt the way you see your hurt. I'm going to say it again. I see your hurt the way you see your hurt. It doesn't mean I don't also see your hurt the way that I see your hurt. I get to have my own perspective. But empathy has to do with the ability to actually understand not just what the person is experiencing, but how they're experiencing it. What is actually painful to them. It gives, most of us start by seeing pain through our own eyes, and we see their pain and we think about moments that hit our pain, which is necessary and helpful for us to lean in and connect a little bit. And there's some sympathy that emerges in that. Like, yeah, I'm familiar with that. I know that pain. And some people just need a little bit of that sympathy. And we're like, hey, I get it. I know that pain too. But there's something profound that happens when we can sit with someone and actually give them the experience of having their pain seen in the way that they see it, having their experience understood in the way that they understand it, builds connection, deepens intimacy, and unlocks things that are profound. The challenge in this is that as parents, when we choose to step into moments and see our children, and to see what they're experiencing through their eyes, that leaves us unseen. One of the greatest challenges in parenting is how often we are unseen by our children. They want us to see them, they want us to understand them, and then they go about their lives as if they're taking us for granted, as if they don't care, as if they don't even consider how much effort we put into that meal or how much we work to keep the house clean. They don't even care. Because that's what children are supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be exploring. And developmentally, a 4, 5, 6-year-old is just developing a concept of self, let alone a concept of other people. And that part of our responsibility as parents is to be able to tolerate seeing without being seen. And for many of us, this is a really, really painful place, because a lot of us have had experiences of not being seen when we were supposed to be seen.
Right.
Many of us have been in leadership with people who were supposed to be seeing us, and they took up all the space, and all we got to do was to see them. And we went through all that experience, and we're never seen and we're never acknowledged. And some of us carry that. And now we get into a position of leadership where we are being asked to become the spiritual parents and to see without being seen. And it is going to challenge that pain in us.
That's why there's groups like this.
That is why there are groups like this. And I do, for our regional pastors, I do a monthly, I call them triage groups, where I get pastors together. Basically, they're parenting groups for pastors, where we get to lament and confess and reflect on the ways that we haven't been seen, the ways that we've been complicit in the pain of others. Because as many of you are as parents, you know that parenting is exhausting. And sometimes you just need to get with some other parents and just look at each other and go like, yep, I wanted to throw my kid against the wall yesterday too. Right. And just be able to be honest about some of those moments. And that's, so in being able to be empathetic, to actually enter into someone else's experience, we have to be able to allow our experience to remain unseen. And the relational and emotional skill that is critical in this is curiosity, is the ability to ask questions that give us access to the experience that people are having. And the spiritual practice is community, and specifically community of parents. That we need to get with other parents who can support us and encourage us, lament with us, confess with us, a place to reflect, a place to process so that we can go back to being parents in a way that is honoring to others.